In the second scene of the second act of what is perhaps the greatest English play that's ever been written, one of the key characters stands on her balcony. And she asks the question upon which the entire play stands. What's in a name? She wants to know. That which we call a rose would by any other name smell as sweet. And it is a question that seems to take for granted, in fact, that names don't matter. That it doesn't matter what you call a rose. That what matters is its essence, its scent. And down on the ground, down below the balcony, her lover, Romeo, believes what she says. And he says, I'll take thee at thy word. Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized, and henceforth I will never be Romeo. What's in a name? They're saying nothing at all. But is it true? Not according to the play. For all through the play, both Romeo and Juliet attempt to escape their names, and they fail in the end. And in the end, the names Montague and Capulet prove stronger even than their love. And their love cannot overcome the enmity between the names. Only their deaths, in fact, can bring the hope of reconciliation. Can even bring it again. So the bottom line, according to Shakespeare, is that yes, names matter. They matter a lot. Names matter a lot in the Bible. In fact, the Bible very clearly assumes that a name is far more than a string of sounds put together. That a name, in fact, goes to the heart of something or someone's identity. Oh, it matters what you call a rose, the Bible would say. And that brings us to the whole question of identity. Identity is key. If we do not know who we are, what can we do in this world? And I think that today, in many senses, we are living in a time of crisis of identity, where people are desperately scrabbling to figure out who they are. Ask someone that question. Who are you? Who are you really? They will often scramble to answer you. They will sense that just a name alone is not enough. And they'll seek to justify to you who they are. Some will turn, for example, to their ancestors, those who have come before them, and say, look at these, my ancestors, they tell me who I am. But others, and I think this is especially true of younger people, don't want to look back like that, and they will look to other things. I've had people tell me, for example, I'm a vegetarian. And I knew that was about more than just a dietary choice for them. It was about their identity, about who they were. People will point to things that they do. I'm a dancer. I'm a canoeist. I'm a scrapbooker. People find their identity in their work. That's who I am. But of course, people who do that are in for a bit of a crisis when they come to a point in their life when they no longer do that thing that gives them their sense of identity, and their identity goes into a crisis. But also look around at all the people who seek to broadcast their identity to the world in various ways. People adorn their bodies with tattoos, with piercings, as a way of crying out, I believe, this is who I am, look at me. Others are constantly posting, you know them on Facebook, on Twitter, on Pinterest, whatever, and saying, yes, world, this is who I am, see who I am. People need that sense of identity. This is a good quest. People are seeking to establish their identity to themselves and to the world. But not all things that people do to express and find their identity are good, and I think there's something in there that's worth examining. And so during this month of June, this is what I've decided to do. There are 5 people in the Bible, 5 key characters who at key moments in their lives changed their names. And as I say in the Bible, the name goes to the central identity of the person, so they change their identity. And so during this month of June, I'm looking at those 5 stories and finding the lessons for us in our bewildering modern world where people are in search for identity. We begin today with Abram, who of course we know as Abraham. God comes to Abram and gives to him a new name, a new identity. Now the first thing that God does, and I think this is very important, the first thing that God does when he comes to Abram is he tells him his own name. God comes to Abram and says, I am El Shaddai, which means I am God Almighty. And there is the first step. For any sense of identity we have, any sense of who we are, is first dependent on who God is. And only because God is the Almighty One is Abraham able to find a new identity for himself. It starts with God's name, God's identity. But God does come to Abram to change his name. And what does the name change signify? Well, Abram's old name is made up of 2 parts of Hebrew. Ab means father, Ram means high or exalted. And so most people have assumed that Abram's name simply means my father is exalted. In other words, up until this point in his life, Abram has found his identity in his father, in his ancestors, the great ones who have come before. This is indeed a common way for people to deal with the problem of identity. When we want to figure out who we are, we often first turn to our ancestors, those who have gone before us. And you all know people who really get into this, who dig into their family trees, who can lay out an entire chart for you and say, look, this is who I am. These are all my ancestors. Others don't go that far, but they will point to various important, illustrious predecessors who have passed things on to them. Others just take great comfort in where they have come from, culturally, traditionally. People find a sense of identity in their exalted fathers. Churches do this too, of course. Often when you want to get to the heart of what's really, how a church sees itself, how a congregation sees itself, you start talking to them, what do they tell you? They tell you the stories of the glory days of that congregation. They tell you the stories of the past and how they built it. It's part of our sense of identity as a congregation as well. And I want to be clear here, there's nothing wrong with finding a sense of identity in your ancestors and in those who have gone before. It is a normal and healthy way to come to a sense, or at least begin to come to a sense of who you are. But God comes to Abram at a key point in his life and says, that's not enough though. You need something more. You need to begin to see yourself as more than just who your fathers and ancestors made you to be. And so God gives Abram a new name. And now the new name is kind of harder to figure out. It's not entirely clear in Hebrew what this new name means. But the book of Genesis points out that it kind of sounds like the Hebrew phrase, Father of many nations. And so that seems to be the point of it. That Abram is to find himself a new identity in being a father to many nations. This is a way of pointing Abram to the promise that God gave to him when he first came to him, way back at the beginning. God came to Abram and said to him, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That name Father of many nations, nations plural, is a reminder of that promise. That the blessing that God gives to Abram is not just for himself, not just for his heirs, but for all the nations of the earth. The odd thing, however, is this. When God comes to Abram and tells him that you must take this new identity, none of that has happened yet. God has given the promise. You will become a great nation. But apart from Ishmael, who apparently doesn't even count according to God, Abraham doesn't have any children. And the very idea that Abraham and Sarah could have any children at this point in their life is so ludicrous that in the next passage, after the one we read this morning, when God even mentions the possibility of Sarah having a child, Abraham laughs so hard that he falls down on his face. It's ridiculous. It's hilarious. So this promise is so remote, so impossible as to be, laughable. And yet here, God is calling to Abraham and telling him that he must now find his identity, his sense of who he is, in this thing that has not yet come to pass. That is completely laughable. I've actually heard a lot lately, I don't know if you've noticed this, a lot of churches, in fact, are changing their names. Have you picked up on this? There's one local case that I know of. There's a church down in Gold that used to be known as Forward Baptist Church. Today it's known simply as Forward. That's the kind of name change that various churches are going in for these days. And let's look at that. What did they do there? They basically dropped one word. But what a word. They dropped the word Baptist. They dropped the word that tied them in to who they had been, to their ancestors, the ones who'd gone before, the traditions and the heritage that had been passed down to them. That's what they were willing to let go of. And that's not a single case. I've heard of many other churches going through the same kind of thing these days. There was a church in Leamington, where I was before I came here. It was the Mennonite Brethren Church. Well established in the community. They decided to change their name. They became Meadowbrook Fellowship. Cleverly, they kept the initials that everyone was familiar with, but they completely changed the name and entirely, once again, lost that heritage, those traditions, those ancestors that had gone before, that told them who they were. And these kinds of name changes, churches are doing all over the places. And I think that maybe in a way, in those name changes, what they're trying to get at is the real struggle that congregations are having today with that sense of identity. That sense that maybe God is calling us to no longer just find our identity in our exalted fathers, in the ones who have gone before, and the heritage that we've received. But that we need to find our identity in something else, something new, something yet to come that has not yet materialized. Now, I don't necessarily think the way to get at this issue is through a name change. It's kind of a gimmick as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. I'm not suggesting that that's something we should consider as a congregation at all. But whatever we do need to think very carefully, very clearly about who we are, who we need to be in this world, and who God is calling us to be. Following our worship here this morning, we are going to go into a congregational meeting, and I hope you can stay for it. I hope it won't be too long. But during that meeting, we will be looking at some important plans that have been put together or that are being put together that will guide this church in many years to come. Important decisions. And I think it's really important that we do not make important decisions like that without a strong sense of who we are. Who is making that decision? And here's the thing, if we simply see our identity as who we have received from our exalted fathers, from our ancestors, that may lead us to act in certain ways, to preserve, to maintain good impulses indeed. But it also might lead us to avoid risks, to avoid trying things that our ancestors would not have accepted or been familiar with. But what if we see ourselves instead not as who we have been or who has gone before us, but as who God is calling us to be? Even if that promise that God lays out before us is not real yet, even if at this moment it seems so remote, so far away, so laughable that we might fall on our face laughing, imagining it. But what if we saw ourselves according to that idea? How would we look at our building, for example? We've got this wonderful building, beautiful building, functional building that serves us so well. But is it simply a heritage that we've received that has been passed down from us, from our exalted fathers, something just to be maintained? Or how should we look at it? Can we see it as this place that God uses to minister, to give food to the hungry, to give clothes to the naked, to minister to the people around us and the community around us? We will see this building as a place of people coming together, openly sharing, talking with one another with the things that are on their heart, finding healing and hope. We will see it as a place of warmth that does not depend on any heating system, a place of light that is not generated by Cambridge and North Dumfries Hydro, a place of hope in the midst of the despair of this world. It's more than just something we've received. It's more than something to be maintained. It's something that God has given us to use to that ministry that He's giving us now, but also to that ministry He's giving us in the future, that we can only begin to imagine now. And it comes down to a sense of identity, of who we are. And if we saw ourselves as God already sees us, not who we have been or who we've received from the past, if we saw us as God already sees us, I think it would go a long way to removing our fear of risk, our fear of change. Not that we go out and act, without thinking or considering the potentials of the options, but that the fear wouldn't be that barrier for us to trip over. That God desires to simply set us free so we might act with compassion and hope in the midst of a dark and difficult road. See, when God came to Abram and told him that he was going to be somebody different, that he was going to be Abraham, Abram didn't have it all together. He didn't have all the answers. He still had lots of mistakes to make. He still had lots of questions to answer. He wasn't yet the person that God was calling him to be, that God was telling him to be, that he was. But the first step God was saying was this: you need to embrace your new identity. You need to see yourself as I see you. That is where it begins. And when you do that, anything is possible. Will you take a few moments in silence?